Saturday, September 30th, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Figure Four Podcast. My name is Doug. This evening, Donald and I talk about the Montreal Screw Job, one of the biggest events to ever take place in professional wrestling. We're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to give our opinions of it. And what do you guys think? We end it at the end of the episode. Was it a work? You guys decide. Enjoy it, folks. Okay, so Bret's contract was up in 96. He was renegotiating and he didn't want to go. But before that, he was under contract. But before his contract was up, he met with Eric Bischoff just to have a little meet and greet, see how they'd get along. There was no discussion of contracts or anything like that as far as Bischoff was concerned. In Bret's book, he said that they talked about money and Bischoff was asking, what's it going to take to bring you over? And supposedly Bret said, I want the same contract as Hulk Hogan plus one penny. Bischoff kind of laughed it off. Now, this was according to Bret's book. Bischoff went on and said this was 100% bullshit. They were just sitting down and they were talking, and because they love the Wild West and outlaws and cowboys and all that stuff. But because Bret's contract was coming up and there was a chance that he may go to WCW, Bischoff wanted to see how they were going to get along. And that was about it, because he couldn't talk money because Bret was still legally under contract with the WWE. So as Bret was negotiating what was going to be a 20-year deal, Hogan's contract was also coming up. So WWE had a choice to make, because Hogan actually sat down with Vince and was talking about possibly coming back in 96, 3 months into this NWO thing, which we all know was hot as shit. So McMahon but what Hogan was asking was just crazy numbers. Couldn't really afford him. McMahon did make Hogan an offer that he could at least go back to with WCW to maybe get some more money, because WCW could still match it. And he was going to honor the offer if WCW said, we don't want you. But I mean, at that point, NWO was hot as shit. So of course they were going to sign him for more than what WWE wanted. So they went with Bret on that 20-year deal. Now you have the rundown. What was in that contract as far as like years and money in different areas? Because all I had was a 20-year deal, and I knew it was top heavy for when he was performing still as a full-time wrestler, but I don't have the specifics where it was broken up year to year or within every 4 years or whatever.
Right. So what I found online was that Bret's 20-year deal, when Vince flew to Calgary and offered this to him, there were some other things that Bret would ask for later on, like creative control and stuff like that, leading up to Survivor Series. But what Vince had put on the table for Bret was $10.5 million, and it was broken into three phases. Years 1 to 3 would be where he was like active on the roster. He was a main event competitor. He would make $1.5 million per year. Years 4 to 10, he would be considered a senior advisor to Vince, in which he would be making $500,000 a year. And then in years 11 to 20, he would be considered what they call a standby legend, where basically they may use him, they may not use him, but it guaranteed that he was going to be making $250,000 a year, leading into his middle age, so that he was going to be financially, he was going to be taken care of. Now, in comparison, in what WCW was offering, in like by matching that up to the WWE contract. So the WCW contract that him and Bischoff had talked about, it would have been a 3-year deal worth $9 million, $2.5 million per year. Bret would be working 125 days, which would break down to about 10 to 11 or 12 shows per month.
Right.
In contrast to that, the WWF or E, if however you want to call it at this point, it would have seen him making $1.5 million per year for those first 3 years, and he'd be working 275 dates per year.
Okay.
So financially, it would make more sense for Brett to take the WCW deal because, I mean, like Kevin Nash had even said it when him and Scott Hall had jumped, making more money, working fewer days, spending more time with family, sign me up.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, it's obviously he's making half of, well, basically making for the sake of $1 million, he's making the same amount that Vince McMahon offered him in three
Yep.
years as opposed to 20. But he didn't want to leave anyway.
He was loyal.
He really, 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 really wanted to stay. Now, what was shitty, and I didn't know this until I was listening to Conrad Thompson's podcast with Brother Love with Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard. When they were ironing out this contract, he let Vince McMahon know that he was going to re-sign with the WWE the same night everyone else found out. Now, I don't know the timeline of when he agreed to the contract, but when he showed up on Raw that night and he did the whole spiel, no one's done as much soul searching as I do, and when you get made a great offer or whatever the hell it is, he let everyone know. He showed up to the building an hour before the Raw actually went on the air and told them backstage. And at that point, he still hadn't signed the contract, which is kind of shitty. Like Bruce Pritchard even said, like it's not cool, and Vince McMahon was sitting at the table and he was like, oh, all right, thank God. Vince
Yep.
knew, but until he actually put pen to paper, they weren't 100% confident. He could have went out there and said, I'm going to Nitro. Ha ha, there it is. Fuck you all. You
Yep.
know, but I mean, it's Brett. I mean, but I guess they weren't sure, which, like, I don't know. Would you have been pissed off if you had been made this offer? Well, I don't know if I'm going to sign it right now, but an hour before we go live and you give me a hot mic, that's what I'm going to let you know. Would you be pissed? Would you be sweating a little bit? Like,
If I'm Vince, I'm definitely sweating because here you've got company right now and offered something from WCW. You've already lost a couple of big name talents, and you could be potentially losing your champion. So for him to, and I mean, did Vince know that the contract hadn't been signed when Brett went out? I mean, I don't know,
well, I'm sure.
but
Well, the
I
contract
mean,
was
Vince was
not
probably
signed. He just agreed to it an hour before they went live. So,
yeah,
and what Bruce Pritchard was saying was he could have said could have went out there live and said, I'm going to Nitro, which tells me
yeah,
there was no pen to paper yet. It was just like, yeah,
yeah,
I'm going to sign your contract and I'm going to go out and tell everyone live.
yeah. I mean, if
So
if
maybe there was
if I
still
were Vince,
maybe he still had the contract, his old contract, maybe it hadn't expired yet. But even if it hadn't expired, we don't know how much longer was left on that contract.
no,
So maybe it was a matter of weeks and he was, maybe fuck you. Yeah, I just came out and said I'm going to Nitro in 3 weeks. Who knows? But I mean, it's Brett. He wouldn't do that. But either way, what getting back to it, that's why I'm thinking that the new contract wasn't signed.
yeah,
And I
if
don't think they put an uncontracted wrestler on national television to possibly make a fool out of Vince. Right?
and I mean, they were live too at the time, like they
Yes.
weren't doing recorded shows.
Nope.
So, like you said, I mean, Brett could have came out and flipped everybody the bird and say, screw you guys, I'm going down where they're, the land of milk and honey. I'm going to Atlanta. If I'm Vince, I'm sweating bullets because you don't say you have an assumption because Brett's been a loyal guy for 14 years
That's
up to
right.
that point.
Yeah.
So you're under the assumption that he's going to come out and okay, he's whether he's still under his old contract or if he's not contracted at that time, you're thinking he's going to come out, he's going to say the right things, um, but you don't know. I mean, Hall and Nash just basically they walked. I mean, there's the Madison Square Garden house show where him and Triple H and Scott Hall and Shawn Michaels, they had the big hug out section at the end of the show. But I mean, this is live. You're live on national TV, on USA Network. What is Brett going to say? And for Vince to actually put his trust in him up to that point, it's like Vince is either very stupid or he's got an awful set of testicles on him.
See
Because
that
I
that
I
whole
wouldn't have let Brett do that.
that whole Hall and Nash thing in Madison Square Garden, that was weird to me because obviously, like, they signed Scott Hall didn't sign his actual WCW contract before he left. He sent a letter of intent saying that
Okay,
he was going to sign. So at 11:59 p.m. with 40 seconds, he could have signed a new WWF contract and
right.
stayed with them as long as it didn't roll into the next day, because all he signed with WCW was a letter of intent. And in his contract, when his contract expired, he had no 90-day non-compete clause. Neither did Kevin Nash.
Okay.
That's why as soon as their contracts ended, they were on Nitro. Well, Nash's ended a week later, but Scott Hall
Yeah.
finished up in the Garden on a Friday or Saturday, and Monday he was on Nitro. He was
Yeah.
lucky in that way. And that's why that whole NWO thing and him and Nash showing up on television works so perfectly, because holy shit, they were just on WWE TV. What's he doing here? Because there
Right.
was that no 90-day non-compete. I think that's what started the non-compete clause, because
Okay.
that just floated WCW to the moon
Oh,
whenever
absolutely.
Scott Hall showed up.
I
So
love it. I loved his comment when that first night on Nitro. You all know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here.
that was a
And
huge
then he,
thing.
oh my God, I remember we were watching that episode, and you're like, "What the fuck? That's Scott Hall." I'm like, "What? Razor Ramon's on Nitro." I'm like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah. It was, well, because again, there was no 90-day compete. He was just
Yeah.
on he was just on Raw last week. What the fuck?
Yeah.
But it's that whole that and and I'll say it again, that's why I think that 90-day compete clause, I think that's where it kicked in, because you're not going to come off red hot and
Yeah.
go to another show. And that's why that whole, it was almost like an invasion thing.
Yeah.
You don't know why I'm here. I think that's
Yeah.
why it kicked in so good.
Oh, they played that, man. They played that perfectly.
So Brett gets his contract, and his first big match is with Steve Austin at the 96 Survivor Series. Steve Austin wasn't Steve Austin yet. It was a good match, blah, 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 blah. But I think what Vince was thinking was, it was almost like Hogan. You can only rescue the girl from the tracks so many times, and we got to
Yep.
change things up a little bit. Now, at this point, Brett and Sean are pretty much in direct competition with
Yep.
each other. So, I mean, whether you liked him or you hate him, the fans were still going to follow Shawn Michaels more than Brett. So, Vince tries to sell Brett on turning heel. And after a
Yep.
little while, after the Survivor Series match, we roll into WrestleMania. The whole Austin thing. I mean, Austin had said, "It's never going to be done, Brett, as long as I'm breathing air." And they battled and they battled. So we roll into WrestleMania, and that was the greatest two-way switch I had ever seen in one match. The,
Yep.
the face turned heel, and the heel turned face. Whether you wanted him to or not, the fans loved Austin anyway. So
Absolutely.
they had that whole match, got color. Wasn't supposed to, but they got color. Uh, Brett's a heel. A little bit. I mean, he's not full blown. He was kind of like pissed off a little bit. He beat up Austin after Austin passed out and all that stuff from the blood. And we talked about this. We kind of touched on it earlier, that in that match, Austin was supposed to pass out with no blood. which would have
Yep.
looked hokey.
Yep.
Brett cut him. He gave him color because Austin wasn't comfortable with doing it. Made it look like
Yep.
he ran into the railing. Wasn't part of the match. Wasn't approved by the office or anything like that. Vince was a little ticked off, but whatever. The match looked amazing, so I think they got a pass. So all of a sudden, Brett's a heel, or he's on the verge of becoming a heel. The whole Canada thing really hasn't started yet, but he's planting the seeds when he starts with
Yep.
you American wrestling fans. You know, you glorify criminal conduct and all this stuff, but the whole pro Canada thing hasn't started yet. So he goes over at WrestleMania. Austin is on his way to being a superstar. What did you think of the switch? Because that was the first time I had ever seen a face and a heel switch places in one night.
I've never seen that take place. Now, keep in mind there was a little bit of a gap, and we've talked about it before that I wasn't paying attention to the business up until the last maybe 3 4 years. But at that time, I had never seen anything like that ever take place. Um, I don't think that match is going to go over as being what it ended up being unless Austin bled.
Oh, for sure.
I th- I think him getting bladed, I think that put that match over. Because to see him just screaming in pain by being in the sharpshooter, I don't think I don't think that match gets the notoriety that it ends up getting if Austin isn't like pouring blood, and like there's one point where he starts pushing up off the mat and Brett's just leaning back in that sharpshooter and like the blood's coming down his face. It's like
And
someone
through
tossed a
his teeth.
bucket
Through his
through
teeth.
his teeth.
That's one of the greatest shots I think I've ever seen. And he's
Absolutely.
screaming, trying to get out. And no, I've bled out. I've lost too much.
Yeah. Like that, if it wasn't for him bleeding in that match, it doesn't go over as well as it does. And I think that just really helped sell the switch. Like you said, the baby turning heel, heel turning baby. I mean, Austin wasn't where he would eventually end up with the crowd,
Not yet.
but he was on. He wasn't there yet, but he was like that catapulted him.
Yeah.
Uh, um, Now on that with Vince pitching that idea to Brett, like, well, how about we turn you heel? And then they're kind of talking about it, and it's like, well, I've been the hero for so long and all this kind of stuff. Brett turning heel, that pitch to me, I don't know if Vince actually knew it at the time, but that ended up actually being one of the things that would eventually lead to Brett being screwed, because it's like, okay, well, you want me to be a heel in the States where 95% of our matches take place, and I'm going to be a hero in Canada.
And overseas
How
too. But again, it was
oh, the people.
how often did he go there?
Yeah, I mean, the people in Germany, especially in India, they love Brett. And like he thoroughly enjoyed going over there, and he talked about how when they would do their world tours, people in Germany would come running up to him, and they loved him. But like when you think about it, it's like he couldn't be the same person that he was in the States after Vince turned him heel. Like there's no way.
Yeah.
There's no way. But yeah, I mean that match at WrestleMania, that I'd never seen anything like that ever before, where the heel turned face and the face turned heel, like at the same time, literally.
So around this time, this is where Sean, he injures his knee. He's got to forfeit the WWF title.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, no heads up to the office or anything like that. Not only is his knee hurt, he loses his smile. Mummy says I lost my smile. Now, everyone else was like, what the fuck? What's this about? And there were lots of rumblings and Bret Hart, this is where it started, because they weren't at odds yet. but they knew they were going to start directly coming into competition with one another. But this was around the time that Shawn Michaels had a habit of not doing the honors for guys. And
Hmm.
the original plan was that night was for him to drop the title to Sid in like a 5-minute match or something like that. Of course, Shawn didn't want to do it. He did it like he did with the Intercontinental Championships. He just passed it over. And this is where Brett started like, well, this guy has no respect for this thing we're doing. He has no
Yep.
respect for me. And I don't even think the plan at the time was for him to drop the title to Brett. I think it was
Right.
always either a Vader or a Sid thing. But this is where it started with everyone thinking like he just doesn't want to do a job for anyone. And I
Right.
think it was around this time, like especially with Vince, he started almost having buyer's remorse about Brett like being locked into a 20-year deal
Hmm.
worth $10.5 million, which even today is still a lot of money. I mean, in the big scheme of things in sports, it's not a lot of money, but at the time, that was huge goddamn money. But
Absolutely.
I think he was looking more at Shawn as being the face of the company and taking it to the next level rather than Brett. That's just my opinion whenever Shawn lost his smile.
Yep. Well, I saw a YouTube clip, and they were talking to Jim Cornette about it, and he's like, there was some animosity between the two because at the time when Brett signed that 20-year deal, Shawn had already signed previously. So like, you've got Brett pulling down 1.5 million and Shawn's going to end up being the face of the company, and his contract was only 750.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, sure, like, they've talked about this before that, the belt, the championships in the business are, they're props.
But he also at the time, Shawn Michaels still had 5 years on his contract.
Oh yeah.
So it's not like it could even be negotiated. He agreed to that contract a year or two before. So
Yeah.
Brett's was up and Brett was still over like Rover. You know, good on Brett for having that front end loaded contract. But Shawn Michaels wasn't in the right frame of mind to even think of like that at the time.
No. No, I mean, he was coming into that age where it was like he was all about himself. He wasn't thinking about, what's good for the business
Not at
kind of
all.
thing. He was more so focused on what's good for me, what's good for HBK. Um, Looking at that, and you just pointed it out, like that he wouldn't be willing to put somebody over. Um, I think it was more along the lines that he wasn't willing to put Brett over because they were starting to develop that little bit of nitpicking.
Yeah.
It started with nitpicking behind the scenes kind of thing.
Yes.
And I think
Nobody
when he
thought his
lost his
knee was,
smile,
no one thought his knee was injured as bad as it was, but it actually was.
no, and Brett came out and he said he still to this day doesn't believe that Sean was as bad and gimped up as what he was letting on to be. Um, we'll never know.
No.
We'll never. I mean, whatever doctors would eventually find out. We'll never know. We're not going to be privy to that. But that I would say around that time, that's when the nitpicking started, and like that's when you started to see that they just didn't really like each other. I mean, in the ring, Brett has always said, regardless if he had heat with somebody outside of the ring, when it came to in ring like matches and in house business, you take care of that first.
That's right.
You don't let the personal side slip in, and that stays in the back. But they you could tell early on they just didn't like each other.
It was getting to that point. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The seeds were already planted.
Yeah.
Okay. So Shawn goes away, his knee is toast, needs some kind of surgery or has to fix it up. And the ironic thing is, in the spring of 97, Brett injures his knee and Brett needs surgery. but he's not going to be doing backflips off the top rope like Shawn Michaels is doing just to give an interview proving everyone that his knee maybe isn't as fucked up as he's letting on. So they have a big thing. Shawn comes back and he's getting better. His knee's better. He got his smile back, whatever the fuck. And Bret's in the ring in a wheelchair after his surgery on Raw. And they're closing the show, and the ending of the show was supposed to be Shawn super kicking Bret. And that's how they're going to end the show. And he's probably going to do a little dance, and Bret lays on his back like a drool. But Bret conveniently is not seeing the cues from the ring guy, the ring bell keeper, camera guys, announcers at ringside. He's not seeing any cues. And before this all went down earlier that day, they were just talking about how they have to trust each other and whatnot. And then Bret pulls this. So Shawn kicks Bret. It doesn't make air. They're already off the air by the time it happens because Bret says he forgot his cue or a line he was supposed to end it with. And Shawn gets backstage and everyone's like, well, what happened? Shawn says, what do you mean? Well, it didn't make air. And Shawn flips out. That's it. The gloves are coming off. I'm fucking done with this guy. After they had just talked about, Bret was just talking about, Shawn, trust me. Just trust me. So that's where it wasn't just nitpicking anymore and the seeds weren't planted. Shawn really thought that Bret was out to almost kind of sabotage him, I guess you could say. And he's pissed off. And you know what? Bret swears to this day he had no idea that the cues were being given to go off air or whatever the case may be. I think Bret might have did this on purpose a little bit. That's just me. Swears he didn't, but I think he did.
He totally stole that moment from Shawn because, I mean, we've seen it like, post airing when it should have been on. Like that could have been like an iconic moment had it been seen in real time, like as they were on the air. Like you said, Bret says that, I forgot my line, or I forgot the line that was supposed to trigger the kick or whatever it was. He rambled on the microphone right up until they were going off air. I think he knew what he was doing.
You'd like to kick me, wouldn't you? But you don't have the insides to do it. The boy toy. Oh, that beer is good. So that's where it really started. Like, I don't trust you, fuck you, between and now, as much as I love Bret, I will say he's kind of the instigator that really made the big ball of shit start rolling downhill, because Shawn's like, fuck you, you're not going to outdo me, because it's about a week or two later, they're on Monday Night Raw, and the Sunny Days comment comes out. Now, you can see as he's talking, cameras on the Hart Foundation, you look at Bret. Bret's kind of emotionless. It didn't face him with, you've had some sunny days, my friend. But if you look at Owen, Owen's like, oh, fuck. And they kind of like, Bret's still not getting it. And that's one thing. I mean, you're on the road 275, 300 days a year, and you're literally home like 5 days a month at that time, because they were just running from the 80s to the 90s. It's not like now. They were running nonstop because they were so hot. And when you're home for 3 days and your son comes up to you and says, Dad, what's going on with you and Sonny? When your father comes up to you and says, yeah, what's going on with you and Sonny there, that little whore? And your wife says, what the fuck is going on with you and Sonny? I can see why Bret would get pretty pissed off at that. Now, Shawn crossed a line. You didn't get your kick on TV, but now you're starting to fuck with a man's family and his married life. I think if you want to send a receipt, that was too big a receipt for someone not getting a kick in.
I'd be pissed. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, if I were in Brett's shoes, yeah, I'd be pissed too. But I mean, in Sean's case, like, you didn't get in a super kick, and so you're going to start dragging this guy's family life into the scene. Like, there's in professional wrestling, there's the in-ring stuff, and then there's the behind the scenes stuff. That's if there's any bit of beef, like legit beef between those two, that needs to be taken care of behind the scenes. That doesn't get aired like dirty laundry on TV, where the public's going to see it, the man's family is going to see it, in which they saw it,
And that's the
and
thing.
then Brett comes home.
That's the thing. Like Brett always said, anything he ever said about Shawn Michaels, he said about Shawn Michaels, the wrestler, the performer. He wasn't saying anything about Sean Wickenhammer or whatever the fuck his last name is. But Sean attacked Bret Hart. He attacked him directly, and
Yep,
now your family's involved. And yeah,
yep,
that's too much. And he did get a talking to. Listening to Bruce Pritchard, he did get a talking to. Uh, wasn't cool. Don't be doing that stuff, right? But at the same time, when they were going for the juggler with these promos, they also talked to each other. Hey, can I say this? Can I say that? I was like, yeah, say whatever you want. Eventually, it was just go out there and can you top this? But then that leads
yep.
up to a fight about a month later, 3 weeks to a month later, uh, or it could have been the next week. I don't know. I'm not sure on the timelines, but fight breaks out and there's chunks of hair pulled out and there's fucking holes in the walls and unsafe work environments. Uh, Brett went after Sean and said, "You little fucker, you're screwing with my family. Give it up." Now, if you were a betting man and you
Yep.
saw that fight, who would you put money on to win?
Brett's taking that in a heartbeat. Brett is chewing him up and shitting him out like within 10 minutes of him going in and out. Uh,
Do you blame Brett for going
Sean,
after
yeah,
him like that? Now, the
not one
story
bit.
is they had some time off, and then Brett's getting this from his family. So by the time he's back on the road, he's hearing this for the short time he's home, and he's fucking hot. Now, supposedly,
Yep.
the whole Sunny Days thing wasn't talked about before Sean went out there and said it. If you were Brett, would you be hot? Would you have gone at him like that? Because things already
I'd
weren't good with him and Julie.
I'd be steaming, man. Like, especially if him and Julie are trying to patch things up, like you said, it like if things weren't good between them, and then this comes out, like shit, I'd be hot as hell. I'd be flying to whatever town if I knew where Sean was staying, man. I'd be going there to pull out more chunks of his hair. Maybe not necessarily out of his head.
So, so they so they break them apart. It's all done. Sean goes running into Vince's office and he throws a big possum-sized ball of hair down on Vince's desk and screams, "This is an unsafe working environment." And he turns around and he literally leaves. He's gone. He said, "I quit. I'm not coming back." Well, he's already under contract. You can't fucking do that. And he wants to go to
Yeah.
WCW to be with Hall and Nash and X-Pac and all that shit anyway. Rumor is, uh, originally it was Jerry Lawler still has the bag of hair, but it's actually Jim Cornette. Maybe an ex-wife of his. I think it's his ex-wife. Actually, still has a freezer bag full of that ball of hair from Shawn
No way.
Michaels. That's the story. But would you sell that on eBay?
Fuck yeah, I would.
I fucking would. Why not? Hey, it's Shawn Michaels' hair. Smell it. You can't smell it now because he has none. So Sean leaves, says he's not coming back. He's in breach of contract. Vince threatens to sue
Yep.
him. For whatever reason, he brings his father in to talk about this, about his contract.
Okay.
Or Vince went to see him or something like that. But eventually, Sean comes back. And at this point, Vince is getting pretty fed up with Shawn Michaels' antics anyway. Even though he's a
Yep.
moneymaker and he's going to be the face of the company, Vince is getting,
he was starting to spiral. He was starting to spiral out of control at that point. I
I,
think,
yeah, I think his
like with
demons were starting to get a hold of him a little bit here.
yeah, yeah,
So Sean comes back. Then, next thing you know, in Madison Square Garden, Vince lets Brett know that, hey, I know you just signed a 20-year deal, but I can't afford you. You're doing me a favor and you're doing the whole company a favor if you go back to WCW and try to get your old offer. Now, we talked about this earlier too. You sign a contract,
yep,
and like we said, back in the day, Vince didn't have guaranteed contracts. He just offered a chance. So, but he gave you a basic contract, 10 days at 15 days at $100 a shot. So a $1,500 contract. It was a bullshit contract. But if you wanted out of it, you couldn't get out of it legally unless he wanted to do you a solid. We're not
right,
talking about $1,500 now. Now we're talking about $10.5 million over 20 years and a
yep,
man's livelihood.
yep.
Just because Vince had buyer's remorse, could Brett have gotten some kind of legal, could he have filed a lawsuit? Because would Vince be under breach of contract just because you can't afford me? I don't give a fuck. Pay me. We have a contract. There's never any talk about that. Why Brett, I mean, I know he didn't want to sue Vince and they were close and he was loyal to him and all that stuff. But Vince wants out. Go back to WCW. I'll help you get more money. And when the contract is up, you can come back. Hopefully, we're in a better financial situation then. Was it buyer's, in your opinion, was it buyer's remorse on Vince's part that I just committed $10.5 million, which back in the, I mean, still a lot of money today,
Yep.
but back in the
It's more than
90s,
what I have.
but back in the 90s, that was $10.5 million was probably equivalent to nowadays, probably $25 million with inflation and shit like
if
that.
not, if not 30.
So, what say you? Do you think Brett should have put his feelings aside instead of renegotiating with WCW if he really wanted to stay? Or should he have said, screw you, we have a signed agreement, I'll sue you if you try to get out of this?
To me, that's a Vince problem. If he's having buyer's remorse after a year that he flew out to Calgary. He went to Brett's house and he's like, "This is what we're putting on the table for you. This is your contract. This is what we're willing to commit to." If he originally said, "We are willing to commit to you for 20 years over, X amount of dollars, 10.5 million," then if he's having issues coming to terms with that, then that's a Vince problem.
And
That's not Brett.
you know what?
That's not Brett's agent.
That says a lot about Bret Hart too, because he gave up 3 years worth $9 million,
Yep.
like we talked about earlier, to work 20 more years of his life to stay with Vince McMahon.
Yep.
I mean, he basically had his contract in 3 years in WCW, where 20
Yep.
years, that's what he would have made. Now, he renegotiates, he gets his deal. So they had plans. They already knew Brett had found out before this that they were going to be working at the Survivor Series in 97 where the screw job happened. But there were still plans for the two of them
Yep.
down the road, between a pay-per-view or two and then the Royal Rumble, possibly WrestleMania. That's not a for sure, but
Right.
Royal Rumble for sure.
Right.
Obviously, Brett signing that contract with WCW sped things up at the Survivor Series. So,
Yep.
but before that, Brett went to Sean, so the story goes, and says, "Hey, Sean, I found out we're working at Survivor Series. I just want you to know that you'll always be safe with me and I'll always be a professional and I have no problem putting you over, put the belt on you." And Shawn Michaels turns around, looks at Brett, says, "I appreciate that, but I just want you to know that I am not willing to do the same thing for you." And he turned around and
Yep.
he walked out. Now, this whole Montreal thing, Brett always said, like, even if you watch the documentary that they did, it was about being a Canadian hero, and he doesn't want to drop the belt in Montreal, blah, 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 blah. But he'd be willing to forfeit it or drop it in Ottawa the next night. It had nothing more
Yep.
to do about being a Canadian hero and losing in Montreal. It was fuck this little playboy. He has no respect for me. I just
Yep.
offered to do the honors for him. He's not willing to do the same thing back. And again, they had plans for Royal Rumble and all this stuff before
Yep.
he went and signed that deal with WCW. Fuck him. I'm not doing it. And he went to Vince McMahon
Yep.
and said, I'll drop it to whoever you want. But obviously, Survivor Series was already advertised. It had to be Brett and Sean.
Yep.
Uh, he just didn't want to do it to Sean because Sean didn't have any respect. Uh, it had nothing more to do about being Canadian hero or dropping the belt in Canada.
I don't think so.
And you
I
know
don't think
what?
so.
If someone talked to me like that, I wouldn't want to fucking do a favor for him either.
No, I wouldn't put him over. Like at that point, like, here's Brett offering the olive branch, saying, like, I will do this for you. I have no problem doing this for you. It's good for the business. And for him to come back and say, I appreciate that, but I wouldn't do the same for you. Yeah, I mean, in Brett's point of view, I'd totally flip him the bird too, and I'd say, fuck you. I'm not doing it.
So a week before Survivor Series, Bret Hart is leaving. Like everyone knows now, he's leaving WWE, and he's still WWE champion. Bret, we got to drop the belt to Sean this way. No. Bret, we got to drop the Sean this way. Kiss my ass. Bret, we got to drop the Sean this way. Suck a dick. He's not. He's just not. He's hell bent. He is not dropping this belt to Shawn Michaels.
Yep.
So that's when it starts. I mean, I still don't know. Like, Bret, your boss comes to you and says, okay, first of all, I'm going to breach our contract, our 20-year, $10.5 million contract. I'm going to breach it. I want you to go get a better deal at our competition. You'll be doing me a favor. Okay, cool. Oh, by the way, you're still WWF champion. You're a week out from Survivor Series. You know Bret is leaving. And you're hell bent on putting that belt on Shawn Michaels at the pay-per-view. Do you think this was part of Vince McMahon's ego? Now, this is around the time people started saying, let's just fuck him. Let's just fuck him. But we'll double cross him, whatever. Do
Yep.
you think part of it, with Vince McMahon being so firm on you have to drop the title in Montreal, it has to be Montreal, even though Bret could have went out the next night in Ottawa and forfeited the title. And I know they didn't really trust him because at this point, Bret contractually didn't need that pay-per-view. His dates were already fulfilled. He could have
No.
left Montreal with the belt and said, fuck you, I'm going to Nitro and I'm going to throw it in the trash on Nitro, which they actually couldn't have done because they had a lawsuit from that originally. But do you think part of this was Vince's ego? He just couldn't let Bret just come in and forfeit the belt, which I also get too, because you're my boss. You're telling me to do something and I'm telling you, suck it. Do you think it was part
I
of Vince's
think I
ego
think
that was bruised that because Bret just wouldn't bend over and do what he said?
I think there's part of that. I think there's also part that he didn't want to go down that same path that he went with Alundra Blaze, aka Medusa. He didn't want to experience that again. He didn't want to risk that because for her to show up on Nitro and say, "This is what I think of the WWE Women's Title," and just drop it in the trash,
Yeah.
um,
Which was more an
that was
embarrassment to the
probably still
company.
fresh in his head. Oh
Losing,
yeah, hundred
like
percent.
Medusa was not a financial loss to that company whenever she left. She
No,
just wasn't. She was a non-issue.
no. I think it was more along the lines of like the principle of it. Vince didn't want to see WWF WWE property dropped into the trash or have Brett show up on WCW with a WWF title.
Again.
I think he again, yeah, I think he was maybe fearful of that. Um, and he was, I I don't know if it was more so his ego or that he was worried about how it was going to impact the company. Like if Brett had like just said, after Montreal, and then all of a sudden shows up on Nitro the next night, or whatever night that he eventually ended up showing up. Um, showing up on the competition's TV show the same night as your show, but he has your belt.
Yeah.
I think from Vince's standpoint, he was worried about that. Looking at Brett and the way that he's always conducted himself, at least from the fan standpoint, I think he's a man of his word. I think he would have showed up on Raw and basically just said, you know what? I mean, and he was very vocal about how like DX was conducting themselves and the sexuality and all this kind of stuff. He wasn't a fan of how they were portraying everything. Maybe WWE wasn't his thing anymore. And I could see him dropping the belt and just walking out and saying, I'm done. I think he would have showed up the following night on Raw. And I think he's a man's man. He's an honorable man. I
Yes,
think
I
he would have
agree.
done that.
Yeah.
But I think in Vince's standpoint, looking back on the Medusa thing, and I think that ties into it, he didn't want to go down that path again. So he was like, no matter what, he has to have the belt taken from him in Montreal one way or another. It has to be removed from him, and then we're done.
And I also think he
And
was
he made
just
it very.
tired of WCW shitting all over him because they were running away from him.
Oh yeah,
It was.
yeah,
I think it's everything, kind of like a hodgepodge of everything. Like I've fucking had enough of this. Everything is WCW's
yep.
taking my goddamn talent, boys. Like I don't fucking know what to do. I'm just done. They're not taking my belt again. Like.
Yeah,
So we get to Montreal, and before we get there, Brett confronts Earl Hebner and says, Earl, they're going to ask you to fuck me. And Earl, of course, swears, on my kids, I'll never let them do that. Just don't lay on your back. Don't lay on your back so I can't count you out. And Brett asks Earl, if you hear anything, just please tell me. Let me know. And as the story goes,
yep,
they don't tell Earl until he's on his way out to the ring for that match. And Earl's told, listen, Vince McMahon wants you to ring that bell. There's going to be a spot, which still blows my fucking mind that Bret Hart, I understand it goes along with the story. So the referee tells you, don't put your shoulders on the mat and I won't count you out. But they put him in a submission hold. And I understand
yep,
it for the story. I get it. I get it. But it's easy to ring the bell when you're in a submission move because no one's going to know the difference anyway. Oh, he must have fucking gave up. If your shoulders
yep,
aren't on the mat, they can't count you three. That's the only way the match could end. So they look at Earl and they say there's a spot in the match. Brett's going to be in the sharpshooter. Sean's going to put it on him, which, by the way, he didn't know how to put it on. Brett showed him. Brett basically loaded a gun and passed it to Sean and said, here, do it. But
yep,
they're going to put him in the sharpshooter. You're going to ring the bell. What are you talking about? No, that's not right. I don't want to do that. Well, is Bret Hart going to take you to WCW with him? Is Bret Hart going to pay your mortgage? Is Bret Hart going to put your kids through school? Poor Earl Hebner had no choice. He had a job to do. He needed a paycheck. So,
yep,
obviously, and what a way to tell him right as you're going to the ring for the actual match. So, and I touched on this earlier. Whenever they were going to the ring, like Bret Hart was coming out with with the Canadian flag and his kids pulling up his pants because the headbangers had broke his belt, giving him wedgies earlier. They're all going to the ring through the curtain. Bruce Pritchard was at Gorilla. And for the whole pay-per-view, Undertaker was sitting with Bruce Pritchard. Just because he wasn't on the show that night, he was out hurt. And this is right from Bruce Pritchard's
yep,
podcast. I'm not making this up. So before the cameras were following Sean and Brett to the ring, like going through the arena, Pritchard said, "Mark, get out of here. Can't break kayfabe too much. Can't have the Undertaker sitting here watching the pay-per-view with me." So Undertaker went to Vince McMahon's office to finish watching it. That's
Yep.
the start of just an internal bullcrap thing. Misunderstanding, we'll call it. So we get out there. Brett gets screwed. We all know what happened. The sharpshooters put on. Sean acts surprised and leaves. So Bulldog and Owen, and again, this is coming from Pritchard's show. He's sitting at Gorilla. Bulldog and Owen are ready to go in and do the smudge. And all of a sudden the bell rings. Bruce Pritchard is yelling at the timekeeper, "Who rang the fucking bell? Why did you ring the bell?" And then he kind of got it. And Owen looked and said, "Well, what just happened?" And Bulldog looked at Owen and said, "They fucked him. They just fucked Brett." And then they're looking at Bruce Pritchard like, "What do we do?" Pritchard was like, "I don't know." Because Bruce Pritchard had no idea what was going on. So anyway, Brett gets screwed. Sean's got the belt. We watched this in my room with a guy I worked with at IGA when it happened. Now, this was way before the dirt sheets and the internet and all that stuff. We didn't know what was going to happen, but we knew as soon as we watched it that this was bullshit. It wasn't supposed to go down like that. So Brett starts smashing monitors and everything around ringside. They go back. He gets in the shower. Vince comes in, tells him, "I'm going to knock you out. If you're here when I get out of the shower, I'm going to knock you out when I get dressed." So he does it. So everyone knows what happened. We won't spend too much time on that. Vince McMahon got knocked out by Bret Hart. Do you think that... I'm trying to figure out how to word this. Was he justified? Because it's a boss. We'll call him now former employee. We've all wanted to punch our boss in the fucking head or kick him in the nuts or something. Was Brett taking the wrestling business, which is, we all know, scripted? He didn't actually win a world championship or championships. It was given to him in a predetermined contest. Bret Hart took being champion very seriously, probably more serious than anyone I had ever seen. I mean, aside from Hogan, because because Hogan was all about money. And his spot. Did Bret take the whole wrestling business too seriously, do you think? Did it become
he was very proud.
Did it become too real in a fake world?
I wouldn't say that it's a fake world. Like, real injuries happen. Like, guys really get hurt in the ring.
Of course.
I'll bring this up. Brett and Dino Bravo, when they were working a dark show and he broke his sternum and his ribs and shit like that. I would say I wouldn't say that Brett took the business too seriously. I would say that he has a very strong passion for it. He's always carried himself very professionally when it came to the business. And maybe part of that was like scared into him by Stu, because like he always said, like, growing up, that he was very fearful of his father. And like, Stu bringing guys down into the dungeon and stretching them which way that he could possibly stretch a human body. Brett was always fearful of how his father conducted business that way. And he put Brett in a couple of moves and stretched him out. So I would say that it wasn't that Brett took the business too seriously. I think he looked at it that Brett had a lot of respect for the business, if that makes any sense.
Razor Ramon used to, he made a comment about Bret Hart, and he used to say that, like Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Hogan, they were all about money. It was just money. Scott Hall used to say
Yep.
about Bret Hart never cared how much money he made as long as he was champion.
Yep.
Uh, is that fair to say that? I mean, is that, I shouldn't say, is that fair? Is it a bad thing to take such pride in what you do? Like, is the title in any business, not just professional wrestling, is the title more important than the paycheck? Is it all about
Um,
appearance?
I think it depends on who you talk to. Um, Brett was very proud of his work.
Oh, he was very,
He,
yeah,
I,
yeah.
like you go back on any match, and I'll just use him and Davey at SummerSlam. He had to talk Davey through the entire match, and that was a great match.
It was, considering
Davey,
Davey was still high from the night before.
exactly. You know, um, I don't know. I think it depends on you know the personality. Like, Brett was he took the professional very seriously. He took the business very seriously. Um, and I don't think he looks at any of the belts that he won as being, that they were handed to him or anything like that. Like he took the profession and the business very seriously. He conducted himself very professional.
He did, and he always
Um,
said that too. He took a lot of pride in representing the federation, the company, and being the
yeah,
world champion.
yeah. So I don't know. I mean, in terms of, if you want to compare him to like guys like Hall and Nash who left for better money, the fact that he stayed for a longer contract with I mean, it was less money when you look at it, per year kind of thing. Um, I don't know. I think he he looked at the business as being he took the business with an awful lot of pride. He had an awful lot of pride with the business.
I don't
And
think
if that
he
makes any sense.
I don't think he looked at the business as actually being a work either.
Yeah.
He took it more seriously than others did, and he conducted
Yep.
himself well to it. And I'll never I love Bret Hart. I'll never shit on him for that. But it goes back to the whole thing with Shawn Michaels. It just came down to respect. It started off being a Canadian hero, but I think when Shawn Michaels finally just totally and completely disrespected him and said, I'm not going to do the same thing for you, it was, fuck you. This guy has no respect for me. This guy has no respect for the business. It really did, because he had always said all along, and I'll keep repeating this, I'll drop it the next night in Ottawa. I'll forfeit it or I'll lose it to whoever you want, and I don't know. It was, I think, and it's not a bad thing, he took his craft very seriously.
Yep.
He took the wrestling business extremely seriously, but that's also enrooted in his brain coming from where he came from. Now, that being said, okay, so it's over. Survivor Series is done. They're off the air. Vince gets punched, rolls an ankle, whatever the fuck. Hebner's gone. Brett screwed Brett. Was it a work? Was the whole thing a schmoz? Because when you look at, and the reason I say that is because when you look at what happened, the Attitude Era, the seeds were already planted, but it exploded after that, and then Mr. McMahon was invented after that. Brett goes
Right.
to WCW. He makes millions of dollars, even though his career was cut short. Brett gets a great contract, but WCW had absolutely no idea what to do with him.
No, they didn't.
If he had stayed healthy, Vince had said, you can come on back at any time.
Yep.
But even after his first 3 years were done, before the 3 years were done, he signed an extension onto
Yep.
his contract. Everyone prospered. The business prospered. WWE prospered. WCW did pretty okay for a little while, and then they just went to rat shit. But it worked out in the long run for everybody.
Yep.
Was it a work? Was this all a plan and a rouge? by Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart and Vince McMahon. And maybe Shawn Michaels in on it too. But at the time, if it was a work, I wouldn't have trusted Shawn Michaels to keep a secret at that point in his life, because I just don't think he mentally was there with his demons and stuff. You just, when you look at it, like, who had the most to gain? Bret Hart and Vince McMahon. And they both
The end of the day. The end of the day, yeah. I mean, I never looked at it like that before.
I mean, you talk to Bruce Pritchard. He was never. There were a lot of people that were not told about what happened.
Oh yeah.
You look about who knew. Who knew this was going to happen? Triple H. Who's he married to? Who's running the? Stephanie McMahon. He's basically running the company, so he's in the family. Shawn Michaels, who proved he was a loyal soldier. Did the job for Vince. Bret Hart, growing up in the wrestling business, loyal, can keep a secret, can keep kayfabe. Who didn't know? WWE executives, except one, Gerald Briscoe. Gerald Briscoe knew. None of the other executives knew. None of the wrestlers knew. Not even Undertaker knew what was going on. That's why I think Scott Hall, God rest his soul, Scott Hall was convinced it was a work. That they all knew about it, especially when Bret was using his finger and saying WCW on the screen. He said, "You're going to paint in the air the logo of your competitor? That's not going to happen unless it's okayed by Vince." You know, and especially when they go tight on Bret when he's making the WCW logo. I don't know. There's parts of me that says, yes, it was a work, but there's also parts of it just because of, like, there were no lawsuits, you know, like for Bret had creative control in his contract. It wasn't actual creative control, but he had input into what was going on. Hulk Hogan had complete creative control in his contract. Bret had language that gave him a little bit of say, but either way, his 20-year contract was told it was going to be null and void. He wanted out of it unless both had to agree to it. He had creative control, we'll say, in his contract. There were no lawsuits. There's just things to think about. Why didn't this happen? Why didn't that happen? Part of me says yes. Part of me says no. I don't know. What say you?
Honestly, man, I never looked at it like that before until you pitched that to me right now. If it was a work, it's the greatest work of all time.
Oh my God, hands down. Hollywood couldn't write a better movie than that.
Like, and we'll never know. We'll never know. We're not privy to that unless you like started waterboarding Bret or Vince. But I mean, when you pose that and you look back on the events as they happened, you know, Bret brings on this film crew a year prior.
Yeah.
And he's just going to start filming like all of this stuff leading up to Survivor Series.
Convenient, isn't it?
Right? I mean, oh my God. Like
you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? Like,
you can look at both sides of that coin and like you gotta wonder. I mean, Bret was a loyal soldier for Vince for 14 years, 15 years, whatever it was. And to think that, like, I mean, was this really all just a ploy so that both sides would benefit? I mean, when Bret leaves, the Attitude Era starts. Austin is like, you know, he is the measuring stick at that point. The ratings from both sides. I mean, like you got to look at it and think like, holy shit! Like, was this just one big work? And maybe Scott Hall was right. Maybe he was right.
Yeah. And that's the thing. The only two people that'll know for sure are Vince and Bret, and they'll take that to the grave. They'll never tell you the difference. Never, never, never.
Absolutely. I never looked at it like that before. And now that you pitch it, it's like, shit. Like, did we just see the biggest work of all time, and like we all just bought into it?
The question that will be asked for years to come: was it a work? Hey, we gave our opinions. What do you think? Drop us a line at thefigurefourpodcast@gmail.com. We're going to see you next time for another great episode. Until then, my name is Doug. You guys enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'm out. See you next time.